Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers. What if the truth wasn't liberating but dangerous? What if the real ideas that explain human life, our emptiness, our need to lie to ourselves, our illusions of control, weren't just uncomfortable but forbidden? Tonight's story is about the philosophies that were banned, ignored, or buried, not because they were wrong, but because they were too real. If this kind of slow, strange reflection helps you sleep, or think, or simply feel less alone in the world, please consider liking this video, subscribing to our channel, and turning on notifications. We post every single night. And tonight, where are you listening from? What time is it right now, in your quiet little corner of the world? Let us know below. Now breathe slowly. The candle's lit, the world is quiet, and the first idea is nihilism, a word whispered too often by those who don't understand it. People say it like a warning, like a sickness, but it began as a diagnosis, the belief that life, at its deepest level, has no intrinsic meaning, value, or purpose. Not that it's sad or bad, simply that it just is. The most famous voice of this thought was Friedrich Nietzsche, a haunted man, a prophet who saw what others refused to see. He wrote, "God is dead," not because he hated religion, but because he saw that belief itself was dying, collapsing under the weight of science, modernity, and irony. Without God, the foundation of morality crumbles. Without morality, purpose wavers. Without purpose, what is there? Nietzsche feared this collapse, but he didn't preach despair. He warned us, if we don't create our own values, we will rot in passive nihilism, comfortably numb, spiritually starved. He urged instead for something fierce, active nihilism, the courage to invent, to shape, to say yes to life without needing it to say yes back. But that courage is rare, and in its absence, people slide into something darker. They believe in nothing, they trust no one, they drift, and so they reach for meaning, in ideologies, in nationalism, in movements that promise purpose. Some philosophies are banned for their danger, others for their honesty. Cynicism was one of the first. Long before it became a word for bitterness, it was a way of life. Diogenes of Sinope lived in a barrel. He begged, he mocked emperors, he carried a lantern in daylight, claiming he was looking for an honest man. His message: strip away the lies, civilization, money, reputation, all nonsense. He called dogs more virtuous than men. He was arrested, mocked, almost killed. Not because he was wrong, but because he refused the game. He lived outside the story everyone else clings to, like the man in Plato's cave who sees the firelight and runs to the surface. Diogenes saw the shadows, but he laughed at them, and people hate laughter when it points at their gods. Later came Schopenhauer, the philosopher of darkness. He believed life was not a gift, but a burden. That existence itself was a mistake. We are born only to suffer, he wrote. The will to live is blind, insatiable, and cruel. Yet even he did not advocate suicide. He believed in art, in music, in fleeting beauty, as a balm for a senseless world. These weren't the words of a madman. They were the whispers of a man awake in a sleeping world. A world that demands optimism like a drug, that bans sadness as if it's contagious. But what if sadness is honest? What if despair is not a disease but a doorway? Jean-Paul Sartre said, "Existence precedes essence," that we are not born with purpose, we must choose, but choice is heavy. That's where existentialism begins. With nausea, with vertigo. Kierkegaard called it the dizziness of freedom, the realization that nothing is holding us up, and that every act is ours to make or avoid. In Soviet Russia, books that whispered these truths were erased. Solzhenitsyn spoke of the gulags, of men ground into dust for thinking, for asking. In East Germany, philosophers like Rudolf Barrow were imprisoned, not for lies but for unwanted truths. In every age there is a truth too sharp to be touched, and so it is dulled, hidden, or banned, even today. The truth is not always welcome, not when it threatens the systems built on illusions. Political heresies are often just philosophical insights, too raw for polite company. Like the idea that power doesn't care about truth, that democracy doesn't always choose wisdom, that humans vote for comfort, not freedom, or that most revolutions simply replace one set of chains with another. This isn't conspiracy, it's history. It's Machiavelli, who wrote that rulers must learn how not to be good. It's La Boétie, who asked why people obey, not because they're forced to, but because they want to. He called it voluntary servitude, the paradox that haunts every free society. Why do we worship leaders? Why do we follow crowds? Why do we silence the ones who say, this is all a game? The answer is chilling. Because we need the game. Life without stories is too much, and those who break the story threaten the sleep. And so, we shun the cynic, we ban the nihilist, we label the existentialist as depressed. But maybe they're not broken. Maybe they're just awake. Maybe the truth is not about comfort. Maybe the truth is cold, sharp, and beautiful, like a star seen from a cave. So here's the first thought, drifting gently as the candle burns. The deepest truths are not always sweet. Sometimes they are bitter. Sometimes they burn. But they are still truths. And to know them, even in the quiet of night, is to touch something real, something banned, but never gone. The strange thing about meaning is how badly the human mind needs it, how deeply it aches for structure, even if that structure is a lie, a fantasy, a myth whispered by trembling lips in a darkened room, just to keep the soul from shattering, and yet meaning itself cannot be touched or proven or held, only believed. And that belief, that slippery, soft-wrapped substance we call faith, is not reserved only for religion. No, it shows up in every system, every ideology, every government that promises order, promises purpose, promises a place in the grand design. But what if there is no design? What if everything that exists is simply? What exists, not planned, not cursed, not blessed, just there, a spinning void wrapped in patterns too fragile to hold. And that brings us to Camus, Albert Camus, the man who wrote of the absurd, who said life's demand for meaning is met by a silent, indifferent universe, that this tension between the desire to understand and the failure of the world to answer is the absurd condition. Not a puzzle to be solved, but a state to be lived, endured, and possibly, if one is strong enough, embraced. For Camus, the only real philosophical question was whether life was worth living. And in that question lives the tremor that shakes all things. Because if one truly, deeply sees the absurdity of the world, the emptiness of explanations, the collapse of grand narratives, then what holds a person back from stepping off the ledge, from walking into the ocean, from simply stopping? And yet Camus said no, do not step off, do not escape, do not run. Instead rebel, quietly, gently, defiantly. Live without appeal, without hope, without gods, not in despair, but in luminous defiance, like Sisyphus pushing his rock, knowing it will fall again and again, yet smiling anyway, because the struggle itself is enough to fill a man's heart. And here lies the forbidden truth, that meaninglessness does not have to be tragic. It can be liberation, it can be fire, it can be dance, but only if one dares to stare into the void without blinking, without begging it to blink back. But most people cannot. Most people need illusions. They need scaffolding for the soul, and so they invent them, endlessly, loyally, desperately. And sometimes these inventions are called religion, sometimes nationalism, sometimes self-help, and sometimes science. Yes, even science becomes a faith when wielded without humility, when treated not as a method, but a gospel, when certainty is mistaken for truth, when control is mistaken for understanding. And this is where psychology begins to peel away the mask, because buried inside the need for meaning is the terror of randomness, the dread of not mattering, the deep evolutionary anxiety that all of this might just be noise, and so our brains cling to patterns. We find faces in clouds, agency in storms, messages in coincidences, gods in silence, and meaning in suffering. And this is not weakness, it is survival. It is the nervous system trying to tame chaos with stories, even if those stories are broken. Because to believe there is no story is a kind of death. And yet in every age there have been those who chose that death, who walked willingly into the fire of unmeaning and came out laughing, hollow-eyed and alive in a new way, like Émile Cioran, the Romanian philosopher who wrote in whispers and screams about the futility of life, about insomnia, about the unbearable tension between wanting nothing and being unable to escape something, who said that existence is a failure, a betrayal, a grotesque accident, and yet he did not kill himself. Instead he wrote, beautifully, mournfully, like a man sweeping ashes into art, because he knew something few admit, that to live without illusions is not to die, but to suffer consciously. And in that suffering there is a strange, slow freedom. And then there is Viktor Frankl, a man who lived in hell in Auschwitz, and found meaning not in hope, but in the refusal to give up the search, who said that suffering ceases to be suffering the moment it finds a meaning, and that humans can endure anyhow if they have a why. But what happens when there is no why? What happens when the how is too brutal, too long, too grey, and that is where nihilism returns. Not as a theory, but as a symptom, a shadow that falls across the mind when the myths wear thin, when the rituals no longer comfort, when the prayers echo back empty, and the question becomes not, is there meaning, but can I survive without it? And so people reach for politics, for movements, for leaders who promise salvation. And this is the dark door where nihilism meets power, where despair becomes loyalty, where lost souls become mobs and mobs become states, and states become gods again, feeding on obedience, fear, and simplicity. And it is no coincidence that the most totalitarian regimes are the ones that fear philosophy, that ban the thinkers, the poets, the comedians, the madmen, because these are the ones who refuse the script, who laugh at the sacred, who whisper, what if it's all pretend? And systems built on belief cannot tolerate doubt, because doubt is contagious, because truth spoken softly can unravel a million shouted lies, and this is why people like Giordano Bruno were burned, why Socrates was poisoned, why books are banned, why artists disappear, not because they are wrong, but because they're dangerous, because they remind us that reality is thin, and consensus is not truth, and that somewhere beneath all the order is silence, and that silence is terrifying, and also beautiful, because in it we are finally alone, finally honest, finally free to ask without being answered, to live without being reassured, to love without being promised. And this is the secret at the core of every banned philosophy, that the world does not owe us meaning, and yet we can give it meaning, not from above but from within, and that is both the curse and the crown of being human, the unbearable weight of freedom, the absurd gift of knowing we are dust and dancing anyway. There is a kind of comfort in being lied to, a soft cocoon that wraps around the psyche when someone, somewhere, tells us what we want to believe, not because it's true, but because it's familiar. And familiarity is warm, it's safe, it's quiet. And this is where the illusory truth effect begins. It's quiet manipulation. The brain's lazy shortcut that says, if I've heard it before, it must be true. And this cognitive trick is not a flaw, it's a survival mechanism designed by evolution not for accuracy, but for efficiency. Because to question everything would paralyze, would freeze the nervous system in endless loops. So the mind does what it must. It smooths the chaos with repetition. It lets comfort override skepticism. And so a lie repeated becomes a truth felt. And the more we hear something, the more we believe it, even if we know it isn't true. And this effect is not abstract, it's everywhere, in slogans, in headlines, in propaganda dressed as patriotism, in myths sold as news, in advertisements whispering that beauty equals love, that status equals worth. that consumption equals joy, and the mind, soft, tired, overworked, nods along. Because to resist would take too much energy, too much focus, too much time. And so it accepts and believes and forgets that it never believed on purpose. And this is how entire cultures drift into shared hallucinations, not from force, but from repetition, from the same words echoing over and over, until resistance feels like noise, until conformity feels like sanity. And now we are in the territory of political heresy, not the wild-eyed rebellion of chaos, but the slow erosion of independent thought. The kind that happens when everyone starts to say the same things at the same time, with the same empty certainty. And those who question become threats, not because they are violent, but because they are dissonant, because truth is fragile when it depends on volume. And this is why thinkers like George Orwell weren't writing dystopias. They were writing instructions, inverted blueprints of how power works when it controls perception, when it redefines language, when it tells people not only what to do, but what to feel when doing it. And this is where cynicism, that ancient dirty word, becomes a shield, because the cynic knows that sincerity is a tool in the hands of those who want obedience. That sentiment can be engineered, that patriotism can be manufactured, and that outrage can be choreographed. And so the cynic laughs, not because he finds joy in decay, but because laughter is all that's left when the masks fall off and reveal other masks beneath. And this brings us to Slavoj Žižek, the philosopher clown, the madman with the lisp who tells uncomfortable truths while everyone giggles, because it's easier to laugh than to listen. But he reminds us that ideology is not just what we believe. It's what we don't even realize we're believing. It's the invisible air we breathe, the silent norms we obey, the unspoken lines we never cross. Not because we're afraid, but because we've forgotten they exist. And Žižek says, the most dangerous ideology is the one that seems neutral, that seems like common sense, that feels like reality itself. And once you see that, the world begins to crack. Not violently, but quietly, like ice melting beneath your feet, and suddenly you're standing on nothing, and it feels honest, terrifying, and liberating all at once. And now we turn to existentialism again. Because in a world where lies wear suits and truth is drowned in applause, the only honest act is to choose, to stand alone and say, this is mine, this meaning, this belief, this value. It is not inherited, not sold, not borrowed. It is mine, made from the fabric of my own suffering, my own love, my own longing. And Sartre said, man is condemned to be free, not gifted, not blessed, condemned. Because freedom is a burden, a responsibility, a weight pressing down on the soul every moment. Because once we accept that there is no blueprint, no divine plan, no cosmic approval, then we are left with only ourselves, naked in the storm of existence. And it is here, in this raw space, that the banned philosophies begin to glow, like coals hidden under ash, because they do not offer comfort, they offer clarity. They do not promise safety, they promise truth. And that truth is often ugly, often useless, often painful, but it is real. And reality, even in its bleakness, has a beauty that illusion can never replicate. And this is why Nietzsche spoke of the eternal recurrence, not as science, but as a thought experiment. Would you live your life again, exactly as it is, over and over, forever, with every mistake, every shame, every regret intact? And if the answer is no, then perhaps you're not living fully. Perhaps you're still waiting for permission, for rescue, for meaning to come from outside. But Nietzsche's challenge is not to be happy. It is to affirm, to say yes, not to pleasure, but to pain, to say, I will own this suffering, I will own this life, and I will shape it. Not because it matters, but because it's mine. And that is where meaning begins. Not in answers, but in ownership, in the soft, stubborn refusal to look away. And this, perhaps more than anything, is what makes these philosophies dangerous. Not that they're violent or radical or extreme, but that they are too real, too intimate, too close to the quiet thoughts that flicker at 3 a.m, when the world is dark and the mask has slipped, and the question rises, what if nothing matters? And the answer echoes back, then make something matter. And that is the hardest task of all, to live not for reward, not for applause, but for the sheer rebellion of being alive in a world that owes us nothing, to build a life like a sculpture in a desert, knowing the wind will erase it, but building it anyway, and smiling as you do. There's a quiet kind of violence in the way the world insists that people smile, that they be grateful, that they explain away their dread with small talk and their rage with politeness, as if truth should always be softened, filtered, made presentable before it can be spoken aloud. And this is why the darkest philosophies are not cruel. They are honest, and that honesty burns because it says aloud what most only dare to think in silence. And this silence is heavy. It clings to the walls of offices and churches and dinner tables, where everyone pretends to believe that life is progressing, that there is direction, momentum, meaning. But under that surface something festers, something quietly asks, is this it? And this question is not rude or cynical. It is sacred. It is the beginning of awakening. And yet it is punished, because those who ask it become inconvenient. They disrupt the play. They remind others that the script doesn't make sense, and the actors don't believe their lines. And the set is cardboard painted like stone. And here enters the ancient heretic, the soft-spoken rebel, who doesn't scream but simply refuses to pretend. The one who leans back and says, what if it's all a performance and the curtain never rises? And this refusal to pretend becomes a kind of power. Not loud, not cruel, but deep, unsettling, unyielding. And this is what makes certain ideas so dangerous. Not that they incite revolution, but that they whisper something simpler. That freedom begins with unbelief. And when a person stops believing in the myths they were handed, they become immune to control, immune to guilt, immune to the rituals that bind most minds in quiet obedience. And this is where figures like Michel Foucault come in, philosophers who didn't just question morality or meaning, but power itself, who asked not what is true, but who benefits when this is called truth, who examined prisons, schools, hospitals, churches, not as neutral institutions, but as mechanisms of control, dressed in compassion, but driven by hierarchy, discipline, normalization. And Foucault showed us that power doesn't only punish, it defines, it shapes what is normal, what is sane, what is sacred, and in doing so, it builds invisible cages where the door is open, but no one leaves, because they no longer believe there's a world outside. And this is the soft tyranny of modern life, not chains but stories, not oppression but consensus. And when someone breaks that consensus, even just with a question, the system reacts, not with violence always, but with dismissal, with mockery, with silence, because the most effective way to bury a dangerous truth is not to argue with it, but to ignore it, to pretend it doesn't matter. And slowly it fades until another brave soul uncovers it again and again, because truth does not disappear. It waits, and in the quiet corners of human thought, it returns. Whispered through poetry, smuggled into novels, mumbled in late-night conversations, when the masks slip and the heart speaks. And in these moments, the banned ideas breathe, like embers flickering back to flame. And it is here we must speak of the political heretics, those thinkers who saw systems not as saviours, but as predators, who warned that utopias often become prisons, that ideologies rot into dogma, and that the moment a government claims moral superiority, it becomes capable of anything. And this is why thinkers like Hannah Arendt matter, because she saw evil not as monstrous, but as banal, ordinary, polite, wrapped in bureaucracy and good intentions. And she gave us the chilling image of Eichmann, not as a demon, but as a functionary, a man who followed orders, who filed paperwork, who never questioned the system, because the system gave him purpose. And this is the true horror. Not that evil is rare, but that it is boring, that it blends in, that it doesn't wear horns but suits, and it thrives in silence, in compliance, and in the soft murmur of yes men who forget how to say no. And Arendt reminds us that thinking is resistance, that the act of pausing, of questioning, of reflecting is itself a political act. Because thought slows the machine, and this is why dictators fear thinkers, why regimes burn books and silence artists. Because a single honest sentence can fracture an empire, and so they label it dangerous, subversive, antisocial, and sometimes even mad, because madness is a convenient label for those who refuse the collective delusion. And this is where philosophy touches psychology, because in a sick society, sanity looks like rebellion, and rebellion looks like illness. And so people who refuse to conform are often pathologized, medicated, institutionalized. Not always because they are broken, but because they see too clearly, feel too deeply, refuse too loudly. And in a world built on pretense, truth is the ultimate threat. And this truth does not have to be shouted. It can be whispered, it can be written, it can be lived, quietly, defiantly. And this is why banned ideas never truly die. They go underground. They take root in the minds of the sensitive, the strange, the curious, the lost, and they wait. And when the world begins to fracture, when the story begins to crack, they rise like weeds through concrete, impossible to erase because they were always there. And perhaps this is the soft power of heretical thought. Not to overthrow, but to erode. Not to destroy, but to question, endlessly, patiently, until the illusion thins and light filters through, and someone somewhere begins to wonder. What else have I been told that isn't true? What other myths keep me docile? What dreams were planted in me, not to inspire, but to distract? And these questions, quiet as they are, hold more power than armies, because once they are asked, they cannot be unasked. And in that space between belief and disbelief begins the slow rebirth of freedom, not given, but claimed. Some truths arrive too late to save us and too early to comfort us, and so they sit inside us like little time bombs, silent and slow burning, waiting for just the right moment to detonate. Not with fire, but with understanding. And once that understanding arrives, something inside is never quite the same again. Because the illusion we lived in no longer fits. The story we told ourselves no longer holds. And we find ourselves naked in front of the raw machinery of the world, blinking, disoriented, and awake. And this awakening is rarely dramatic. It often comes quietly, like a strange silence in the middle of a crowded day, like a pause between thoughts that stretches too long, like a sentence that suddenly doesn't mean anything anymore. And when it comes, we find ourselves asking questions that once seemed dangerous, but now feel necessary. What am I doing? Who told me this matters? Why does everyone pretend they aren't pretending? And this is the doorway through which cynicism enters, not as bitterness, but as clarity, as the slow realization that much of what we call sincerity is performance, that much of what we call virtue is branding, that many of the institutions we were told to trust are held together by unspoken deals, quiet corruption, and collective fear. And when that curtain falls, when we see the scaffolding behind the sacred, we begin to laugh, not out of joy, but out of recognition, because something in us always knew. Even as children we sensed it, the way adults lied, the way rules bent for some and broke others, the way truth shifted depending on power. And that laughter is the first honest response, the nervous chuckle of a soul that has caught the universe out in its own game. And this is why Diogenes mocked the world with his lantern, why he barked at statues and defecated in public, and told Alexander the Great to get out of his sunlight, because he had nothing to gain from pretending, nothing to lose from seeing clearly. And in that radical poverty, that stripping away of every illusion, he became rich in a way that no empire could rival, because he had nothing to defend, nothing to sell, and nothing to prove. And that is the essence of true cynicism. Not pessimism, not apathy, but the refusal to be seduced by the theatre of lies. And in our time, where everything is curated, branded, monetized, and surveilled, this refusal has become a form of resistance, because the world doesn't just want obedience anymore. It wants belief, it wants performance, it wants the heart as well as the hands. And the cynic says no, not in bitterness, but in defiance, and this defiance becomes a form of sanity, a way of staying whole in a culture that rewards the fragmented, the filtered, the hollow. And it's important to understand that cynicism wasn't always a slur. It was once a school of philosophy, a path to freedom, born in the shadow of empires and temples and promises. And what it promised was not hope, but clarity. And clarity is dangerous, because once you see, you cannot unsee. And once you know, you cannot unknow. And this is why so many prefer the lie. Not because they're stupid, but because they're tired, because truth is heavy and expensive, and illusion is cheap and comforting. And in this exhaustion, entire lives are lived according to scripts no one remembers writing, rules no one remembers agreeing to, and dreams no one remembers choosing. And still the cynic watches, quietly, often alone, often misunderstood, and yet they carry something precious, something unbought, something untamed, and that something is the freedom to not believe, to not clap when told to not smile when dying inside. And this freedom is not glamorous. It doesn't sell well. It doesn't photograph nicely. But it is real. And in a world that confuses reality with visibility, that alone makes it priceless. And now we must speak of another layer, because behind cynicism, there often lives another thing, something softer, more dangerous, more sacred. Grief, the grief of seeing what the world could be and knowing what it is. The grief of having once believed and having that belief betrayed. The grief of loving humanity while watching it destroy itself for trinkets and flags and illusions. And this grief is the shadow of wisdom. It follows all those who truly think, who truly see, who truly feel. And it is this grief that makes cynicism bearable, that turns the laughter from cruelty to compassion. Because underneath the joke is the ache, and underneath the ache is the love. And this love cannot be expressed in slogans or campaigns. It is too quiet, too strange, too unruly, and so it hides behind irony, behind sarcasm, behind tired eyes that see too much and say too little. And this is why some of the most cynical people are also the most sensitive, because they have bled for their clarity, and every joke is a scar, and every silence is a scream. And still they endure, because what else is there to do when the world is on fire? But name the flames and roast a few marshmallows. And now we are close to the heart of what this chapter means. That truth is not always useful, that wisdom is not always welcome, that clarity is not always kind, and yet it is necessary, because someone has to remember, someone has to keep the record, someone has to say, even if only in whispers, it doesn't have to be like this. And that whisper is the seed of revolution. Not the loud kind, not the kind with flags and chants and leaders, but the quiet kind. The kind that happens in minds and hearts and long sleepless nights. The kind that begins when someone turns off the television and sits in the dark and wonders, what if everything they taught me was just a way to make me easier to manage, easier to sell to, easier to ignore? And that wondering is the birth of something holy, something banned, something too human to be permitted in a machine world, and that something is thought slow, painful, sacred thought. And once it begins, it cannot be stopped. There is a difference between being lost and being aware that no one ever knew the way in the first place. And this difference marks the line between despair and freedom, because most wanderers are not seeking direction. They are seeking certainty, the illusion that someone else has figured it out, that there is a right path, a correct answer, a final destination, where all the aching finally makes sense. And the tragedy is not that life lacks a map, but that we spend so much of it pretending one exists. And those who admit the truth, those who shrug and say, there is no path, only walking, are seen as dangerous, because they refuse to uphold the lie. And in that refusal lies power, because it is the beginning of a life ungoverned by borrowed meaning. And this is where existentialism breathes its slow, thoughtful breath. Not in rebellion, but in realism, in the quiet acceptance that to be human is to invent one's own compass in a world without north. And yet even this is too much for many to bear. And so they retreat not into ignorance, but into narrative. The soft tyranny of stories, because stories make the unbearable beautiful. They give shape to chaos, and this is not wrong. It is human, but it is also the birthplace of every control system that has ever existed, because once a story takes hold, it begins to demand loyalty. And once loyalty takes hold, it begins to fear questions. And once questions arise, the story begins to crack. And when stories crack, civilizations tremble. And so the story must be protected at all costs. And this is how societies end up punishing truth-tellers, not because they are wrong, but because they make everyone else feel foolish for still pretending. And here comes the paradox, because while humans crave freedom, they also crave certainty. And these cravings do not coexist peacefully. They fight, and the battlefield is the human mind. And this is why freedom often feels like anxiety, and why control often feels like safety, and why people willingly trade autonomy for structure, if the structure offers a convincing enough lie. And this is not weakness, it is design. The human psyche was not built to tolerate voids. It fills them automatically with gods, with goals, with governments, with gurus, and these fillings become sacred, not because they are true, but because they are necessary until they are not, until someone, somewhere, decides to stop believing. And in that moment, the machinery falters and the silence rushes in. And it is in this silence that the deepest philosophies dwell, the ones that don't offer comfort, only clarity. And among them stands Kierkegaard, who wrote of the sickness unto death, the despair that comes not from failure, but from forgetting who you are, from living as a copy, from choosing to be anything other than your truest self. And he knew that the greatest threat to the human soul was not suffering, but distraction, the endless noise that keeps us from ever asking the one question that matters. Who am I beneath the roles, the names, the masks? And to ask that question sincerely is to invite collapse, because the answer is not given. It must be built. And that building is terrifying. It means letting go of everything you were taught to love. Letting go of borrowed identities, and this letting go feels like death. And in a way it is the death of the false self and the birth of something unnameable. And this is why the path of the philosopher has always been lonely, because it begins where certainty ends, and most people cannot follow, not because they are incapable, but because they are unwilling. And this unwillingness becomes its own kind of prison. And so most never leave. They decorate their cells. They call the bars beliefs, and they scoff at the few who choose the open air, because the open air is cold and uncertain and vast, and it asks too much. And yet there are always a few who choose it, who step into the wind without a coat, who let go of the map and trust only the next step. And these few become dangerous, not because they incite violence, but because they inspire doubt. And in a world built on consensus, doubt is a virus, a whisper that spreads in the dark and makes even the faithful tremble. And this is the real reason certain ideas are banned, not because they're false, but because they are infectious, because they undermine the spell. And when the spell breaks, so does the control. And this is why ancient rulers banned books, why modern governments censor thinkers, why even families exile the black sheep, because systems crave harmony and truth often disrupts. And yet disruption is the only way anything ever changes. And so every banned philosophy is a kind of rescue boat, not from the world, but from illusion. And those who climb aboard do not escape life. They enter it fully for the first time, raw and unfiltered. And this entrance is painful, it strips away comfort, it exposes the fragility of all we took for granted, but it also offers something rare, something sacred, the chance to begin again, not as who we were told to be, but as who we might truly be. And this rebirth is not loud, it doesn't trend, it doesn't market well, it doesn't promise riches or followers, but it promises reality, and that promise is enough for those who are done with pretending. There's something quietly terrifying about the fact that most people live their entire lives according to rules no one can name, created by people no one remembers, for reasons no one ever really questioned. And this quiet terror is not loud or dramatic. It doesn't scream. It hums like a refrigerator in the background of our lives. A low-level buzz of inherited expectations and invisible constraints. And from the moment we're born, we're taught not just how to behave, but how to see, how to think, how to feel, how to want. And the tragedy is not that we're shaped, but that we forget. We were ever unshaped, that we forget we had choices before we had names. And this forgetting is what makes certain ideas so disruptive, because they don't just question what we believe. They question the machinery that made belief possible, and one of the most quietly subversive voices in this space was Ivan Illich, a former priest who walked away from the church and then began dismantling every institution he touched. Not with fire, but with questions. He asked why schools exist, not to educate, but to socialize. Why hospitals treat sickness while producing dependency. Why development means dependence, and he argued that institutions often achieve the opposite of what they claim. That schools make us less curious, that hospitals make us less healthy, that progress makes us less free. And his work was banned in some circles, ignored in others, because it touched the sacred, because it suggested that maybe the systems we trust the most are the ones doing the most harm, not through malice, but through design. And this idea that harm can be structural, that evil can be mundane, that control can wear a smile, is perhaps the most unsettling realization a person can have, because it means the enemy isn't always out there. It's in here, in the assumptions we carry, in the habits we never chose, in the comforts we cling to. And Illich wasn't alone in this. He stood in a long lineage of thinkers who dared to ask the impolite questions, the unmarketable truths, and the pattern is always the same. Those who point out the rot are painted as the problem because the system cannot admit it was built on faulty ground, and so it protects itself, not with facts, but with feeling, with sentiment, with identity. And in this way, people begin to defend the very structures that oppress them, because those structures give them a name, a story, a place to stand, and to question them would be to risk everything. And this is why obedience is so often emotional, not rational, and why logic rarely changes minds, and why belief is so sticky, because it binds itself not to reason, but to fear. And this fear is not always loud. Sometimes it's just the fear of isolation, the fear of exile, the fear of becoming that person who sees too much and says too little, and loses the warmth of belonging. And so people choose silence, and they call it maturity. They call it compromise. But somewhere deep inside, a small voice still asks, is this really it? And that voice never goes away. It waits in the background, in the quiet hours, in the moments between roles, and it reminds us that something doesn't fit, and some answer never landed, and some pain never fully left. And that voice is the ghost of authenticity, the part of us that remembers being free before we were shaped. And this memory is dangerous because it cannot be monetized, it cannot be weaponized, it cannot be controlled, it simply is. And when a person reconnects with that memory, they begin to see the cracks in the facade. And once seen, the cracks spread, and what was once invisible becomes unbearable. And at this point, many retreat, they try to forget, they distract themselves, they throw themselves deeper into the very systems that betrayed them, hoping that more of the poison might become the cure. But some continue. Some choose to walk through the fire, not because they're brave, but because they are finished with pretending. And in that walk they meet others, wanderers, questioners, heretics, and together they form something fragile and real, a kind of underground brotherhood of the awake. And this brotherhood has no uniform, no creed, no leader. It is simply a vibration, a hum, a look in the eyes of someone who sees too. And when you meet someone like this, it instantly, not through words, but through the absence of illusion. And this knowing is a kind of relief because it means you're not insane. It means others have walked the same path and lived and laughed and even found peace. And that peace does not come from answers, but from the end of questions, from the surrender to not knowing, from the acceptance that meaning is not given but made. And once made, it must be remade again and again, because life is not stable, it is fluid, and any meaning that lasts must flow with it. And this is the great secret, the band. Philosophies carry that life is not a puzzle to be solved, but a paradox to be lived, and those who try to freeze it into certainty will always suffer more than those who let it move through them like wind through trees. And so the task is not to find the meaning, but to become the kind of person who can bear the absence of it, and still create beauty, still offer love, still dance in the ruins. And this kind of person cannot be governed, cannot be sold, cannot be frightened. And that is why these ideas are feared, not because they are dark, but because they are free. There is a certain kind of madness that arises not from chaos, but from too much order, from the crushing weight of a world that pretends to make sense, even when everything inside screams that it doesn't. And this madness is not loud, it does not howl, it simmers, it whispers. It curls up in the quiet hours when the smile cracks, and the job title doesn't fit, and the relationship is more performance than connection, and the news is just a carousel of managed narratives, and something deep in the body begins to protest, not with words but with fatigue, with nausea, with quiet terror. And this is not dysfunction, this is awareness, trapped in a system that cannot tolerate it. And this is where the most quietly dangerous thinkers have always lived, in that liminal space between what is seen and what is felt, between what we are told to believe and what we actually experience. And among these was Friedrich Nietzsche, whose name is often dropped but rarely read, because to actually read him is to be cut open, is to be confronted by a mind that saw too clearly, a mind that would not look away. And Nietzsche's madness was not a collapse, it was a consequence, a result of seeing too far into the abyss of human behaviour, too deeply into the contradiction between what we say and what we do, between the masks and the hunger behind them. And he named this contradiction the will to power, not just the desire for domination, but the raw impulse to assert, to impose, to define, to make the world bend to one's shape. And he saw that even our morality, even our compassion, was often just this will in disguise, that beneath the virtue was strategy, that behind the saints were wolves in sheep's clothing. And this wasn't cynicism, it was a call to honesty, a plea to look at ourselves, not as we wish to be, but as we are. And this honesty terrified people. It still does, because it removes the veil. It strips away the comforting myth that we are good and noble, and instead shows us as raw, trembling creatures, fighting for significance in a world that doesn't care. And yet Nietzsche did not despair. He offered a response, a vision of the Übermensch, the one who creates value in the void, the one who dances even in the storm, the one who says yes to life, not because it is good, but because it is real. And this yes is not naive. It is forged in the fire of having said no to every false promise, every hollow morality, every inherited truth, and found nothing left but the self. And in that self, a spark. And this spark is dangerous because it cannot be controlled, it cannot be preached, it cannot be sold. And so Nietzsche was labelled mad, and his work distorted and softened, and sold back to a world that could not handle its sharpest edges. And this is the pattern over and over. Those who touch truth too closely are broken by it, or broken by those who cannot bear it. And yet the madness is not in the seers. It is in the world that calls itself sane, while it marches in uniforms, kills in the name of peace, worships money as salvation, and calls it progress. And so maybe the real question is not why Nietzsche went mad, but why more people don't. And the answer is simple. Most people are asleep not because they're lazy or stupid, but because they're tired, because waking up is not a moment. It is a process, a brutal peeling away of comfort, a daily confrontation with absurdity. And this peeling does not stop, it continues until everything is raw, until even joy hurts because it is so real. And then if you survive that, you begin to live. Not the life they sell you, not the one with goals and milestones. and curated happiness, but a life that is jagged and uncertain and holy in its ugliness. And here in this space, philosophy becomes breath. It stops being an academic game and starts being a lifeline, a thread that ties you to others who have also broken and rebuilt themselves from nothing. And these others do not offer answers. They offer presence, and in their presence you feel seen, not for what you pretend to be, but for what you are. And this recognition is the antidote to madness, because madness thrives in isolation, but it dies in the shared silence of those who have seen too much and still choose to speak. And this is why the most powerful act in a collapsing world is not to scream. It is to whisper truth into the void and wait for an echo, and sometimes the echo takes years, sometimes it never comes. But still we whisper because the act itself is sacred, and this whispering is what banned philosophies do. They do not shout, they wait, they linger, they infect, they survive in margins and footnotes and jail cells and long walks alone. And when the culture becomes sick enough, when the lies become too loud, they re-emerge not as solutions, but as invitations to break open and begin again and again and again. Because awakening is not a destination, it is a spiral, a loop, a wound that keeps bleeding wisdom. And this is why Nietzsche said that those who fight monsters must take care not to become them, and that if you gaze too long into the abyss gazes back, because he knew that to see clearly is to risk becoming what you despise, unless you also learn to love what is broken, to forgive what is ugly, to accept what is real. And in that acceptance, there is a kind of grace, not the grace of salvation, but the grace of standing unflinching in the face of life and saying, I am still here, I am still breathing, and I will make something beautiful out of this ruin. Most people don't realize how much of what they believe isn't really theirs, how much of what they fear was planted, how much of what they desire was suggested, and how many of their thoughts are echoes, not origins. And this isn't an insult, it's an observation, because the human mind was not built for originality, it was built for survival, and survival favors imitation, consensus, the safety of the herd. And so we absorb not just language and culture, but values, assumptions, frameworks, the invisible architecture of belief. And once absorbed, these things become invisible. They fade into the background, like wallpaper you no longer notice, and you grow inside that wallpaper, thinking it's the world, thinking it's truth. But sometimes something happens, a crack, a tear, a glimpse of the wall beneath. And in that glimpse, something shifts, and you start to wonder, whose thoughts are these? And this wondering is dangerous because it leads to peeling, it leads to stripping away the layers. And beneath the layers is nothing. And that nothing is terrifying and liberating. And that is where true philosophy begins. Not in libraries or classrooms, but in that internal collapse, that moment of cognitive disobedience when you stop accepting and start asking. And one of the most profound thinkers who explored this terrain was Carl Jung, who spoke not of the mind as a blank slate, but as a layered cathedral, filled with ancient voices, symbols, myths, patterns. And he understood that to know oneself was not to invent, but to uncover, to descend. And this descent meant confronting not only the conscious self, but the shadow, the rejected, the hidden, the parts we are taught to fear, or deny, or avoid. And Jung argued that the shadow is not evil. It is necessary. It is the container of all that was exiled in the name of conformity. And to ignore it is to become its slave. But to face it is to begin integration. And integration is not harmony. It is honesty. It is saying, yes, I am capable of violence. Yes, I am selfish. Yes, I am afraid. And in that, yes, there is power, because now the darkness no longer owns you. Now it becomes fuel. And this process is not welcome in polite society, because society depends on masks, on performance, on predictability, and shadow work disrupts all of that. It creates unpredictable people, people who don't fit, people who ask strange questions and take strange paths, and those people are dangerous, not because they do harm, but because they make others feel the discomfort of their own unasked questions, and so many turn away and call these seekers mad or lost or dramatic, but some follow, some begin their own descent, and in doing so, begin to reclaim what was stolen. And what was stolen is not innocence. It is sovereignty, the right to choose, not just what to do, but what to believe, what to love, what to fear. And this kind of choice cannot be granted. It must be taken, and once taken, it cannot be returned. And this is why true awakening is often followed by loneliness, because the world you re-enter is not the same. The conversations feel thinner, the rituals feel absurd, and the roles feel tight like clothes that no longer fit. And in this space, the awakened often withdraw, not from arrogance, but from necessity, because silence becomes a kind of medicine, and noise, a kind of poison, and in this silence, new thoughts emerge. Not as flashes, but as slow waves, insights that feel remembered, not learned, truths that arrive like old friends. And this remembering is not personal, it is archetypal. It is the soul recognizing itself across time and culture and body. And one of the most powerful aspects of Jung's work was the idea of individuation, the process of becoming whole, not perfect, but whole. And this wholeness includes the contradictions, the paradoxes, the wounds, and the wisdom. And to individuate is to stop trying to be good and start trying to be real. And this realness scares people because it cannot be manipulated, it cannot be predicted, it cannot be bought. And so the individuated are often feared or idolized, but rarely understood. And yet they continue, not because they want to be different, but because they can no longer be false. And this is the quiet revolution that psychology at its deepest level offers. Not adjustment, but transformation. Not normalcy, but wholeness. And in a world obsessed with control, wholeness is radical because it cannot be reduced to metrics. It cannot be scaled. It cannot be packaged. It is alive and unruly and sacred. And this sacredness is not religious. It is existential. It is the sense that life is not a problem to be solved, but a presence to be inhabited. And that presence cannot be inherited. It must be chosen again and again and again. And in that choosing, we begin to remember that we were never meant to live as cogs, as roles, as algorithms, but as mysteries unfolding, and the unfolding never ends. The most obedient people are not those who are forced to comply, but those who believe they are choosing freely. The most effective control is the one that masquerades as freedom, and the most dangerous lie is the one that tells you this is just the way things are. And this is how societies manufacture consent, not through violence, but through story, through repetition, through the slow erosion of imagination, until people no longer ask, what else could be? They just ask, what's next? And this erosion is cultural, but also neurological, because the brain adapts to patterns, it automates thought, it builds shortcuts. And the more often an idea is repeated, the more familiar it feels, and the more familiar it feels, the more true it seems. And this is not speculation, it is science. It's called the illusory truth effect, a cognitive bias studied since the 1970s, which shows that the more we hear something, the more we believe it, regardless of evidence, regardless of logic, because the brain mistakes ease of processing for accuracy. And this is why propaganda works. Not by convincing, but by tiring, by overwhelming, by repeating, and slowly the truth becomes irrelevant. The only thing that matters is what feels familiar and safe. And this is the psychology of control. And once you see it, you begin to notice how deep it goes, how your preferences, your politics, your goals, your fears might not be yours at all, but inherited echoes. And when you realize this, the world changes, not visually, but conceptually. You begin to feel like you're living in a museum of assumptions, walking through rooms filled with beliefs preserved in glass cases with little plaques that say, this is how things are. But now you see the cracks in the glass, you see that the floorboards are rotting, that the walls are just props, and suddenly the museum isn't comforting, it's claustrophobic. And this is where many stop, because to continue would mean tearing down everything and standing in the rubble with no guidebook and no applause and no guarantee. And this is what banned philosophies do. They lead you into that rubble, and then they leave you there because they know that what comes next cannot be taught. It must be chosen, and that choice is brutal. It means letting go of certainty. It means becoming a beginner again. It means questioning even the questioning and finding in the silence not despair, but possibility. And this is why most people reject these ideas, not because they're dark, but because they are demanding, because they take away the comfort of blame and replace it with the responsibility of freedom. And real freedom is terrifying. It does not promise safety. It does not provide identity. It does not guarantee success. It only offers space and silence and the chance to become something unmarketed and unknown, and in a world built on validation. This is a kind of death, but it is also a birth. And the thinkers who lived in this space knew the cost. Viktor Frankl, for example, a man who survived the camps and still said that meaning must be chosen, not found that even in the worst conditions, we are responsible for our attitude, our response, our stance. And this wasn't optimism, it was existential realism. It was the understanding that pain is inevitable, but despair is optional, and meaning is not discovered like a treasure. It is forged like a blade, and that forging requires fire. It requires loss. It requires looking life in the face and saying, I will not let you define me. And this is the core of what makes certain truths dangerous. Not that they are false, but that they make people powerful, and power not granted by institutions is power feared by them. And so these truths are buried, twisted, turned into slogans or symptoms or sin. Anything but what they are, which is liberation. And liberation is not a moment, it is a practice. It is the daily discipline of remembering that no one else is coming to save you, and that the system was never built for your flourishing, only your function. And so you must build your own meaning, your own sanity, your own self. And that building is lonely, but it is real. And once built, it cannot be taken. And this kind of person, the self made not in wealth, but in awareness, cannot be manipulated, cannot be herded, cannot be sold. They are wild, not in action, but in thought. And their presence is unsettling. Not because they attack, but because they reflect. They are mirrors in a world of masks. And when people see themselves clearly, they often turn away. And so these wild ones walk alone, but not empty. They carry something sacred, a quiet knowledge, a deep stability, a sense that life is not what we were told, but something deeper, weirder, more beautiful, and more brutal. And this beauty is not aesthetic, it is existential. It is the beauty of the broken, the unfinished, the real. And once you taste it, the synthetic cannot satisfy, and the scripted cannot soothe, and the plastic cannot pass for poetry. And so you begin to live differently. You begin to listen more, speak less, touch slowly, think strangely, and love without armor. And that love is not soft, it is fierce. It is the love of someone who sees the darkness and chooses to stay anyway, not to fix, not to rescue, but to witness, and in witnessing to honor, and in honoring to heal. There is a kind of silence that feels like drowning, and another kind that feels like truth peeling back the noise of everything that was never real, and exposing what was always there, waiting underneath, still breathing, still watching. And for those who have spent their lives surrounded by false certainties, this kind of silence can feel like madness, like emptiness, like falling through space with nothing to catch you. But eventually, the falling stops, not because you land, but because you realize there is no ground, only flight. And this realization is the beginning of something rare. Not just survival, not just insight, but awakening. The kind of awakening that costs everything and gives back nothing except yourself. Raw, unfiltered, unedited. And this is what many of the ancient mystics spoke of, though they wrapped it in symbols and riddles and robes. But the essence was the same burn, the mask meet the self. And for many that meeting is too much, because the self is not what they imagined. It is not clean or pure or heroic. It is conflicted. It is strange. It is wounded and wild and ancient and holy, and it carries every lie ever believed and every truth ever feared, and to meet it is to grieve. Not because it is bad, but because it was buried for so long, and once unearthed, it demands to be lived. Not analysed, not managed, not optimised, but lived. And to live it means disappointing people, breaking roles, losing approval, becoming unpredictable. And this unpredictability is the enemy of systems, because systems run on sameness, and sameness runs on fear. And fear is the leash that keeps the wild heart tethered, and the moment the heart slips, the leash, the whole thing, shakes, and this shaking is what real change feels like. Not a revolution, but a release. Not the crash of empires, but the quiet refusal to play along. And in this refusal, there is a clarity sharper than logic, deeper than knowledge. A clarity that whispers nothing. You are told is the whole story. Not your school, not your church, not your country, not even your family. Because all of them are stories too. Stories shaped by fear, and shaped by need, and shaped by the hunger to belong. And that hunger is not wrong, but it is not free. And freedom is what the philosophers really meant when they spoke of truth, not facts, not data, not conclusions, but the condition of being unowned and unafraid. And this condition is not achieved. It is remembered, and remembering it feels like morning, like waking up from a long dream and finding the room empty and the script missing and the stage lights gone and just the echo of your own voice asking quietly, what now? And that question is the real beginning, not of knowledge, but of wisdom. And wisdom does not arrive in books or quotes or affirmations. It arrives in scars, in silences, in the space after failure, where something else starts to speak, something softer, something stranger. And this voice is not loud because it has no need to convince, it simply invites. And if you listen long enough, it will lead you not to certainty, but to surrender, not to belief, but to belonging. And this belonging is not to a group or a creed or a cause, it is to life itself. And life is not safe, it is not fair, it is not stable, it is wild and brutal and beautiful. And to belong to it fully is to allow it to move through you, to shape you, to break you, and to love you without explanation. And this is the love that ancient philosophies tried to point to, the love that burns not for what is good, but for what is real. And this is why the most profound ideas are not complicated. They are unbearable because they demand change. Not in policy or opinion, but in identity. And identity is what people cling to when they are drowning, and so they defend it not with reason, but with rage. And this rage is what keeps the machine running, what keeps the illusions stable. And so anyone who questions identity becomes a threat, not because they are wrong, but because they are dangerous to the system, to the story, to the self that is built on borrowed walls and borrowed names and borrowed fears. And this is why so many of the most powerful truths are ignored or mocked or silenced, because they cannot be marketed, they cannot be monetized, they cannot be turned into content or curriculum or consumption. They simply are. And in their presence, everything false begins to crumble, and that crumbling is not the end. It is the invitation to begin again. There is a strange kind of loneliness that lives beneath the surface of modern life. Not the loneliness of physical isolation, but something quieter, something deeper. The loneliness of living in a world where everyone is pretending and no one remembers how to stop. And this pretending begins early. It begins the moment a child learns that certain feelings are inconvenient, that certain questions are unwelcome, that curiosity must be scheduled and wonder must be explained. And slowly the child becomes a person, not through growth, but through editing, shrinking themselves into something acceptable. And that edited version is rewarded with praise, with grades, with roles, with likes, but not with love, because love cannot reach what is not real. And so the hunger remains, and that hunger drives everything, every addiction, every performance, every desperate attempt to be seen. And this is the tragedy of our time, that we are surrounded by mirrors, but none of them reflect, and this is not new. It has always been this way, but now the mirrors are digital and constant and weaponized, and they do not just reflect. They reshape, and people lose their faces trying to match the mask. And the saddest part is they think they're free. They call this choice, they call this self-expression, but expression of what? When the self is forgotten. And here is where we must speak of a forgotten thinker, someone who saw this coming long before it arrived. Guy Debord, the French philosopher who wrote The Society of the Spectacle in 1967. And in that book he described how life was becoming representation, how reality was being replaced by images, by symbols, by appearances, and how the spectacle was not just media, it was everything, the economy, the culture, the very way we think. And he warned that in the spectacle, truth becomes irrelevant because perception is all that matters. And people no longer ask what is real, they ask what works, what sells, what trends. And in this shift, something essential is lost, not just authenticity, but agency. Because when the image becomes more important than the experience, people stop trusting themselves. They wait to be told what to feel, what to fear, what to want. And this is not control through force. It is control through desire. And desire is the most efficient leash ever invented because it feels like freedom, and this is how empires are built. Now, not with armies, but with algorithms, not with swords, but with screens. And the enemy is not out there. It is inside. It is the part of us that wants to be seen more than it wants to be whole. And this is why ancient wisdom matters not because it offers solutions, but because it reminds us that this is not who we have to be. It reminds us that we were once wild, once sacred, once silent. And in that silence was power, and that power cannot be downloaded. It cannot be streamed. It cannot be branded. It can only be remembered. And that remembering hurts because it means facing how much we've lost, how much we've given away for comfort, for praise, for illusion. And in that facing there is grief, but also grace, because grace does not come to the deserving, it comes to the ready. And readiness is not about worth, it is about willingness. The willingness to stop performing, to stop managing, to stop hiding, and to simply be. And that being is terrifying because it strips away every strategy and leaves only the question, am I enough? And the answer does not come from others, it comes from the silence. And the silence always says yes, but not the yes of the marketplace. Not the yes of likes and clicks, the yes of breath of blood of being. And this yes is what the spectacle fears because it cannot be sold, it cannot be measured, it cannot be used. It is simply alive. And aliveness is the ultimate rebellion in a world built on simulation. And so the work of philosophy now is not to argue or persuade, but to remember what it means to be human, not in theory, but in flesh, to hurt, to hope, to fail, to forgive. And this remembering will not make you popular, it will not make you rich, it will make you real. And the real is what the system cannot touch. There is something quietly violent about being told to be positive in a world that is burning something absurd, about being asked to smile while everything around you collapses. And this violence is not always obvious. It comes wrapped in good intentions and Instagram quotes and self-help slogans. It says heal but hurry, love but never rage, accept but don't resist. And in this performance of peace, something essential is lost. Because not all pain is a problem, not all anger is a wound, and not all darkness needs to be lit. Sometimes it needs to be honoured, and this honouring is what the Stoics understood, not as suppression, but as discipline. The kind of discipline that does not avoid suffering, but meets it calmly, examines it, questions it, asks what can I learn, what can I carry, and what can I let go. And among them was Marcus Aurelius, not a philosopher in theory, but in life, an emperor, writing to himself in the margins of war, reminding himself to be humble, to be still, to not let the madness outside become the madness inside. And what he wrote was not for glory, but for grounding. And that is what makes it so powerful, not its eloquence, but its honesty, because he knew that the real battle is not out there, It is in here, in the refusal to become bitter, in the courage to keep showing up, in the choice to be kind when cruelty is easier. And this kind of strength is not celebrated because it cannot be weaponized. It cannot be used to sell products or build brands. It is quiet and constant and invisible. And yet it changes everything because it means you cannot be moved by every wave. And in a culture addicted to reaction, that is radical because reaction is profitable. It keeps you scrolling, consuming, fighting. And the more reactive you are, the less reflective you become. And this is by design, because reflection slows things down. It asks why, it wonders what if, it listens. And in a world built on speed and spectacle, slowness is seen as weakness. But the Stoics knew better. They knew that stillness is not stagnation. It is presence, it is power withheld, not lost. And in that withholding, there is choice, and choice is the foundation of freedom. Not freedom as permission, but as posture, the ability to say no. Not this, not now, not like that. And in that no, a deeper yes can emerge, a yes that is not reactive, but rooted, a yes that comes from knowing who you are and what matters. And this knowing does not come from affirmations or opinions. It comes from sitting with yourself long enough to hear the quiet voice beneath the noise. The voice that says, this is me, not the me. I show not the me I perform, but the me I remember before I was taught to forget. And remembering that self is not an act of ego. It is an act of survival, because the world will try to name you and use you, and break you into pieces that fit its puzzle. And your job is to stay whole, even when that means being alone. And this is what makes philosophy dangerous. Not its conclusions, but its questions, because questions unravel stories, and stories hold up the world. And so to ask is to unmake, and to unmake is to make space. And in that space, new truths can grow, and those truths may not be comfortable or convenient. They may cost you relationships and reputations. They may make you strange and misunderstood, but they will make you real. And the real is what the world needs. Not more content, not more noise, but more people who are rooted enough to hold still while the storm passes through, who are kind enough to stay soft in a hardening world, and brave enough to tell the truth, even when their voice shakes. And the truth is, this pain is not weakness, grief is not failure, doubt is not betrayal, and silence is not empty, it is sacred. And in that silence, everything you are afraid to feel becomes a doorway, and everything you were told to ignore becomes a compass, and the life you thought you lost becomes the life you never dared to live. And that life will not be easy, it will not be neat, but it will be yours, and that is enough. There is a moment in every thinking person's life where the curtain slips and they catch a glimpse of the machinery behind the performance, and for a split second, everything seems absurd. The meetings, the uniforms, the holidays, the hashtags, all of it suddenly feels like a game. Everyone agreed to play without knowing why, and this moment doesn't last. It fades quickly, replaced by the comforting hum of normalcy, but once felt it cannot be unfelt. It lingers like a strange scent, and it returns when the lights are off, when the city sleeps, when the performance pauses and the silence sets in. And this silence is not emptiness. It is presence. It is what remains when the noise ends, and what it reveals is unsettling, because it shows that most of what we call life is ritual, not reality. It is the repetition of gestures inherited from people we've never met for reasons we've never questioned. And this is where cynicism often begins, not as hatred but as heartbreak, the quiet kind, the kind that watches people celebrate illusions and wonders if they know, if they see, and if they do see, why they keep going. And yet cynicism, if left unchecked, becomes another illusion. It becomes a shield, a performance of its own, a way to feel superior while still participating. And so the real work is not to mock the game, but to leave it not in rebellion, but in clarity, not with anger, but with stillness. And this leaving is not visible. There's no announcement, no manifesto, it is internal. It is the simple refusal to pretend, the simple choice to be real, and that realness will not win you awards, it will not trend, it will not attract applause. It will often cost you comfort and connection, but it will give you something else, something rare, something sacred. It will give you peace, and not the peace of avoidance or denial, but the peace of integrity, the peace that comes from living in alignment with what you know, even when what you know is difficult and inconvenient and deeply at odds with what everyone else seems to believe. And this peace is the foundation of real power. Not dominance, not control, but presence, the ability to be unmoved. Not because you're stubborn, but because you are clear. And clarity is a kind of rebellion in a world designed to confuse and distract and seduce. And one of the thinkers who understood this with frightening precision was Albert Camus, who saw that life is absurd, that the universe does not explain itself, that meaning is not written into the stars, and his response was not despair but defiance. The choice to create meaning anyway, to live with dignity even in the face of the void. And this choice is not dramatic, it is daily. It is brushing your teeth, it is showing up, it is saying yes even when no would be easier. And in that yes there is power, because it says, I see the absurdity and I will not bow to it. I will not run from it. I will face it. And in facing it, I become free, not free from pain, but free from illusion. And this freedom is terrifying because it leaves you with nothing but yourself. No script, no scapegoat, no excuse. And yet in that nothing, there is everything. Because now you are the author. Now you choose what matters. And that choice is not arbitrary, it is sacred because it is yours. And this is the secret. All the banned philosophies point to not that life is meaningless, but that meaning is not given. It is made and made again and again and again. And every time it is made, it costs something. It costs the comfort of being told what to believe. It costs the simplicity of being part of the crowd. And yet what it gives back is irreplaceable. It gives back a life that feels like yours. Not theirs, not theirs, not theirs, but yours. And that is worth every loss. Because in the end, that is the only life. You get not the life they wanted, not the life they sold you, but the one you claimed, the one you created, the one you lived, even when no one was watching. All things end, but not in the way we think, not in explosions or answers or applause, but in a quiet fading like the slow dimming of a candle left too long in the dark. And the end of belief is the same. It does not announce itself. It slips in softly through the back door and sits beside you. Unnoticed at first until one day you look at your hands and realize you're no longer holding anything. Not hope, not certainty, not doctrine, just space, just breath, just silence. And this silence is not a void, it is a beginning. It is the place where philosophy truly starts. Not with cleverness or debate, but with stillness, the kind that feels like snowfall or the pause between heartbeats. And in this stillness, the questions return not to haunt, but to invite the ones that never had answers, the ones we were told not to ask, the ones that sound like madness, but feel like home. And this is where the real journey begins. Not the journey to find truth, but to live without needing it, to walk without a map, to build without blueprints, to speak without needing to be right. And this walking, this building, this speaking is not a rejection of meaning. It is a redefinition, a letting go of second-hand certainties in favour of first-hand experience. And that experience will be raw and confusing, and at times unbearable, but it will also be yours. And in a world where so much is borrowed that ownership is everything. And this is the final irony, that what was banned was not dangerous because it was false, but because it was free. And freedom cannot be controlled. It cannot be taxed or templated or turned into curriculum. It breaks molds. It ruins economies. It threatens hierarchies. Not because it burns things down, but because it makes people remember that they were never prisoners. They were volunteers. And this remembering is the true threat, not to governments, but to illusions, because illusions only survive when everyone agrees to see the same mirage, and when one person stops believing, the spell begins to break. And that is why silence matters. That is why walking away matters not to escape, but to witness. To say I see you and I choose something else. And in that choice, others begin to wonder, and wondering is the beginning of revolution. Not in the streets, but in the soul. And the soul does not scream, it whispers, it waits, it watches. And when the noise gets loud enough, when the lights get bright enough, when the promises become too polished, the soul begins to stir. And in that stirring comes the ancient memory that this is not the first time empires have lied. This is not the first time crowds have cheered their own cages. This is not the first time philosophers have been exiled, and books have been burned, and names have been erased, because the truth is not welcome where control is the goal. And yet it survives not in institutions but in individuals, not in doctrines but in doubts, not in sermons but in silence. And this is why the deepest wisdom is not loud. It is not marketed. It is not popular. It is passed quietly, from hand to hand, from breath to breath, in poems, in glances, in the soft words spoken under the breath of a dying fire. And this passing is sacred because it reminds us that we are not alone, that others have walked this path, that others have broken through the same illusions, and that their madness was a form of sanity in a sick world, and their exile a form of homecoming, and their sorrow a form of birth. And so we carry their names not as saints but as mirrors, not as idols but as reminders. Nietzsche, Frankl, Jung, Camus, and the others unnamed, unknown, unheard. And we add our own breath to theirs, not to become like them, but to become more ourselves. And in doing so, we honour the truth, not the polished kind, not the pretty kind, not the one that wins debates, but the kind that sits quietly in the room, waiting to be noticed, the kind that asks only one thing. Do you see me now? And if the answer is yes, then the work begins. Not the work of changing the world, but of seeing it clearly, loving it fiercely, and living in it fully, even as it crumbles, even as it rebuilds, even as it forgets again and again and again. Because forgetting is human, but so is remembering. And each time we remember, we get closer not to perfection, but to presence. And that presence is the only real power. We have the power to choose, the power to care, the power to stop pretending and simply be. And that is what this story has always been about. Not rebellion, not rejection, not despair, but return. The slow, quiet return to what was always true, beneath the noise, beneath the fear, beneath the names. And that truth is not a sentence. It is a sound. It is a breath. It is the space between the lies and the life waiting to be lived. The story just told has now come to its close, a thread gently tied, its images and ideas already sinking into the quieter layers of thought. Yet for those whose minds still drift wakefully, another story begins, one drawn from the ancient words of Lao Tzu, the sage of the Tao, whose voice, though separated from us by centuries, still flows like a river through the valleys of time. In the Tao Te Ching, among its spare and winding verses, lies a paradox, both delicate and immense, that the softest thing in the world, water, can overcome the hardest. The line is simple, almost small enough to miss, yet it holds the weight of a truth seen through long observation. Water yielding to every shape, bending without resistance, never grasping or striking, wears down stone, slips past obstacles, finds its way where nothing else can pass. To Lao Tzu, this was not a mere observation of nature, but a mirror held to the nature of life, a lesson in patience, resilience, and the quiet strength of what does not contend. The world is full of hardness, rigid thoughts, fixed wills, walls built against change. These, like stone, seem unshakable. Yet water, soft and persistent, seeps into every crack, moves without hurry, and in time reshapes the unmovable. It wins not through force, but through its refusal to be forced. In the stillness of night, one might hear the faint trickle of a stream, or recall the sound of rain against the earth, and know in that sound the presence of something that does not fight, yet cannot be stopped. Lao Tzu's teaching is not a call to weakness, but to a strength that appears in the form of yielding, to a wisdom that sees the futility of rigid struggle and instead flows around the obstacle, patient enough to wait for the moment when the obstacle itself is changed. Just as water is clear and without fixed form, so the mind freed from clinging can move through the hardness of life without breaking. This is not the strength of a clenched fist, but the strength of open hands, not the shout, but the quiet persistence that endures beyond the noise. In this way, the soft can overcome the hard, and the gentle can master the unyielding, not by defiance, but by a deeper accord with the way of things. In the landscapes Lao Tzu knew, rivers carved valleys over centuries, rain polished mountains into rounded hills, and the sea, without rising in anger, swallowed stone cliffs grain by grain. He saw in these quiet movements a way of being that did not exhaust itself in battles for control. Water never seeks to dominate the stone, yet in the patient arithmetic of time, the stone changes and the water remains. To grasp this is to see that strength does not always declare itself loudly. A rigid branch may snap in the storm, but the reed bends and survives. In human life, hardness often appears as stubborn will, the refusal to yield an inch, the insistence on victory by direct confrontation. This can win a day, a year, even a decade, but like the stone, it must eventually meet something it cannot break. Softness, by contrast, can seem like loss, like giving way, yet when it is guided by purpose, it becomes a force the hard cannot resist. To yield is not to surrender one's nature, it is to preserve it so that it may continue to act. Lao Tzu's water is not passive, for it moves ceaselessly, shaping the course of its own path. It does not cling to the bank it leaves behind, nor resist the turn ahead. It teaches that resilience is not the same as resistance, and that survival often belongs to what can transform without losing itself. In the human mind, water's way becomes a discipline of letting go, of refusing the tightness that closes off new routes, of trusting that forward movement can happen without force. It asks for trust in the unseen work of time, for faith that slow change is still change. In the candle's soft light, one can imagine the long patience of water in a world of stone, moving where there is space, waiting where there is not, knowing that nothing hard can stand forever against what flows without end. The candle gutters and steadies, the room breathing with a small hush of night air, while the mind turns again to the old pages where water is praised for going to the places others avoid. Low, quiet, unclaimed, useful to all and rival to none. Lao Tzu, a figure hovering at the edge of history, perhaps 6th century before the Common Era, perhaps later, a librarian or a recluse or a road traveller who handed a border guard the verses before vanishing, speaks through the compact brightness of the Tao Te Ching, where the highest goodness is likened to water, because it nourishes without demanding, because it does not contend, because it flows to the valley where pride does not dwell. What does it mean to go low and yet to rise? What does it mean to be soft and yet to overcome? A river answers without speech, shaping stone by patience, widening its banks not by decree but by return, again and again, until resistance becomes a curve and not a wall. The sage reads the river as others read a law code, tracing the clauses of motion in every bend, learning that timing is a deeper strength than force, that placement is a subtler power than pressure. A leader who stands above becomes a peak that the clouds pass without touching, but a leader who stands below becomes the sea, gathering all streams, directing without the roughness of command, governing by yielding, receiving by lowering, guiding by being guided. How can one be guided while guiding, and yet not lose direction? The answer moves like silt falling through clear water after the splash is done, a slow settling that reveals the riverbed again, the shape that was there all along, only hidden by turbulence. In the text, the way is not a plan, but a path already present, the current already moving, The art lies in feeling how to float within it, when to paddle, when to drift, when to slip sideways into a smaller channel that avoids the fallen tree. Water keeps no hard memory of the rock it met at dawn. It continues. It takes the next line of least resistance, not from fear, but from clarity, not from weakness, but from the recognition that the goal is distance, not drama. The body understands this teaching before the tongue can phrase it, for blood remembers its rounds. Lymph makes its silent passages. Tears come and go with their salt, and each breath arrives like a small tide that gathers what must be released and leaves what must remain. The mind which loves to strike can instead dissolve, letting a knot loosen by absence of pulling, letting a word emerge when it has ripened rather than when a moment demands a show of strength. What is a knot to water but a pattern that will unmake itself, if soaked long enough, if left in the patient bath of attention? In the cliffside temple courtyards of memory, the rain falls for ages on bronze bells and tiled eaves, and the patina that forms is not a wound but a blessing, a softening that time writes as praise for what endures without shouting. The sage watches a torrent and a trickle and sees the same principle. That flow is invincible because it refuses to become a single hard shape, because change is not its enemy but its native tongue. Why chase confrontation when redirection will do? Why push a door inward when it will open outward for a lighter hand? Why harden a face when a pause will cool the heat and make the right sentence possible? The stone speaks only in weight, the water speaks in roots, and roots win. To live as water lives is not to resign, it is to reserve energy for what requires it. To avoid paying the cost of pride for small victories that soon become large regrets, to attend to the landscape rather than the score. The text praises emptiness, not as lack but as capacity. The cup useful because it is hollow. The room useful because it holds unfilled air. The valley rich because it receives what the mountain sheds. The sea lord of streams because it is lower than all. What is low but a promise to carry? What is empty but a promise to welcome? In the palace of strategies, this is scandalous counsel, yet history confirms it quietly, for empires that stiffen break on their own corners, while customs that bend with new times endure like reed mats renewed with each season, altered yet the same. The lesson hides in ordinary hours. A pot over flames that are too fierce cracks, a pot over steady coals cooks through. A letter sent in, anger becomes a sharp pebble in the shoe of years. A letter sent after sleep becomes a clear path, seen in morning light. A schedule packed to its lips spills. A schedule with a hollow at its centre becomes a basin that catches what chance pours in. Water does not think of winning, yet it arrives. It does not promise, yet it keeps going. It does not declare, yet it shapes. Is there a gentler power? The page closes and opens again in the mind, and the small candle offers a living commentary, for the flame achieves its task by consuming itself at a pace that does not rush, for haste would be the speed of loss, while measure is the rhythm of service. Patience is not delay for its own sake, it is alignment with what can be done now, and what must be done by hours that have not yet arrived. It is the wisdom to let time work alongside effort, so that effort is not alone. Resilience is not a helmet, it is a spring, not a wall. It is a curve that returns to form after strain. It is a way of continuing that does not require defiance to prove itself. The night listens as the thought finishes its circle. The sage remains elsewhere, or everywhere, saying almost nothing, asking whether hardness truly secures what it tries to protect, inviting the experiment of softness practiced long enough to become unanswerable. A last question ripples through the quiet. When stone is remembered centuries from now, will the memory be the crack or the curve the water left behind? And which of these tells the truer story of strength? Night settles more deeply, and the mind drifts with it, carrying the image of a river through darkness, silvered under moonlight, moving without hurry toward a destination unseen. Lao Tzu's image of water is not a metaphor invented for comfort, but an observation repeated through the centuries, a truth that belongs to the earth as much as to the text. Water is the master of adaptation. It takes the shape of the cup without argument, fills the hollow of the land without condition, and yet, over seasons and centuries, it sculpts entire continents. In the Tao Te Ching, it is written that nothing in the world is softer than water, yet nothing is better at overcoming the hard. The paradox is real because it refuses the usual meaning of strength. In the human mind, strength is often imagined as dominance, the ability to force one's will upon others or upon circumstance, but water teaches that lasting influence comes not from domination, but from endurance, from the quiet persistence that outlives the momentary blaze of force. Watch the river in flood, and you see its temporary violence, but watch it in its ordinary state, and you see its true nature, patient, unceasing, willing to travel the long road rather than claim an immediate victory. To live as water lives is to accept that the world resists the straight line. Rocks will rise, banks will narrow, fallen branches will block the way, and the impatient will turn to frustration. But water turns to finding another path. It curves where it must curve. It pauses in pools where it must rest. It even retreats when the tide draws it back, trusting that it will return again. This is not resignation. It is the wisdom of knowing that the goal is not to win today, but to keep moving for as long as there is movement to make. The sage, observing this, learns to measure time not in days or hours, but in seasons and cycles. An insult received may be answered in silence, not from weakness, but because the answer is already being shaped by patience. A setback may be met with a change in direction rather than a collision with the obstacle. To be soft in this way is to place faith in transformation rather than in confrontation. The stone, after all, is unchanged after the first drop of rain, and perhaps even after 100, but in the length of years it is worn smooth, its edges rounded, its face carved. Water has no memory for revenge, but it remembers its purpose. In the same way, the mind that flows with the Tao does not hoard bitterness or pride. It holds to its direction and allows the rest to dissolve. And there is another layer to water's strength, its humility. It seeks the lowest places. It does not rush to the heights but flows down into the valleys, into the shadowed hollows where others will not go. In this humility, it gathers all the streams, uniting them into a greater whole. The sea, said Lao Tzu, is king of the 100 streams because it lies below them. This is not the humility of self-erasure, but the humility of inclusion, the kind that creates space for others to join without fear. Those who wish to lead without force can learn here, to lead like the sea, by receiving, by making room, by letting others flow toward you rather than pushing them from behind. There is a peace in this, and a power. One can see it in the way water reflects without holding, mirrors without judgment, carries without ownership. The sky may pass across it in clouds or in stars, and water holds both images in turn, never confusing them with itself. A person who can be like this, clear enough to reflect yet calm enough not to cling, becomes as untouchable as the river's heart, for they cannot be disturbed beyond the ripples that fade in their own time. It is easy to admire the torrent, the waterfall, the dramatic rush of water over a precipice, but Lao Tzu's teaching is to admire also the unseen work of water, the slow seep into stone, the hidden flow beneath the soil, the quiet accumulation of drops that will one day wear a channel through the hardest ground. In the long night, as the candle burns lower, this truth feels close. Strength is not the clenched jaw, the raised voice, the unyielding demand. Strength is the silent shaping, the slow approach, the resilience that does not announce itself, but is found still flowing when everything else has stopped. And so the river moves on, and so should the heart. The night deepens, and the quiet becomes a vast plain, unbroken, except for the steady pulse of thought moving like a hidden stream under the surface. The mind returns to Lao Tzu's image, that nothing is softer than water, and yet it conquers the unyielding. To feel this is to see the distinction between speed and duration, between the sharpness of a moment and the depth of a lifetime. A blade can cut once and then dull. A hammer can strike and then rest. But water moves without ceasing, and its ceaselessness is its edge. The Tao Te Ching does not speak of victory in the language of battles, but in the language of seasons. It trusts what is repeated over time more than what is imposed in an instant. The heart of this wisdom is patience, not the patience of waiting passively, but the patience of acting in alignment with the rhythms of the world, knowing that resistance consumes itself faster than endurance does. The river does not push the boulder head on, for that would only exhaust its force in a single, futile moment. Instead, it slides past, finding the spaces, wearing the edges, until the stone is no longer an obstacle, but part of the path. It is a truth both simple and difficult, to remain in motion without clinging to the need to arrive, to understand that the journey is not the means to an end, but the end itself unfolding in each bend, each ripple. To live like water is to accept the shape the moment offers without becoming trapped by it. When a vessel is narrow, water becomes narrow. When a basin is wide, water spreads without resistance. In human life, this is the art of adjusting without losing essence, of bending without breaking, of being shaped by circumstance, while still carrying forward the same quiet direction. Many fear that such yielding is a kind of defeat, but it is in truth the avoidance of unnecessary loss. For what is lost in rigidity cannot be regained, but what is preserved through flexibility may be used again and again. Water also teaches humility, the choice to seek the low ground, the willingness to go where others will not go, not because it lacks ambition, but because it understands that the low ground receives all streams. This is the humility of listening more than speaking, of absorbing rather than resisting, of learning without the armor of pride. In leadership, it is the humility that unites, for those who would be followed must first make space for others to come to them. Lao Tzu saw the sea as the great master, because it lies beneath the rivers, allowing them to flow into it freely. This is a leadership without force, a gathering of strength through reception rather than through demand. In relationships, the waterway is the choice to hold without gripping, to offer space without absence, to reflect without distortion. Water mirrors the sky without keeping its image. So too can one receive the words, the emotions, the presence of another without turning them into possessions. This is a rare kind of strength, for it cannot be taken by threat nor diminished by insult. And water's lesson is not only in movement, but in stillness. A river flows, yet there are moments when it pools into deep quiet, the surface smooth as glass, holding the world's image without a sound. Such stillness is not the absence of life, but its concentration, a readiness to move again when the time is right. In the same way, there are seasons in which the wise do not press forward, but rest, gather, and deepen. Stillness allows clarity to return. It lets the silt of confusion settle so the bottom can be seen again. In the rush to act, many lose their way, but in the pause, the next step often reveals itself without effort. Water also accepts transformation without fear. It becomes vapor in the sun's warmth, mist in the morning cool, ice in the mountain shadow, and returns again to liquid without clinging to any state as final. This is the great teaching for a human life, to change form when change is needed, without resisting the return to a previous form when the time calls for it. Nothing in water says permanence is the measure of truth. Instead, it says that continuity through change is the real constant. To follow this is to be free from the terror of endings, for every ending in water is only a movement to another place, another shape, another chance to flow. And so in the deep hours, the image of water remains, soft, patient, unbroken, not because it refuses to meet what is hard, but because it knows it has no need to struggle. The hard breaks itself. The soft simply endures. And in the end, it is endurance that shapes the world. The mind drifts further into the dim corridors of thought, where the sound of water becomes not only a sound, but a presence, a reminder that all things move toward transformation. Lao Tzu's vision of water is not simply a poetic device, but a framework for living, a method of aligning with the inevitable rather than opposing it. In his teaching, the soft conquers the hard because the soft refuses the single moment of victory. It plays instead for the endless game, where time is the true ally. Stone may resist for years, even centuries, but water's persistence is a promise that cannot be broken. The lesson moves quietly into the heart. One does not have to win today to shape tomorrow. This is the art of slow triumph, the patience that outlives resistance by outlasting it. And yet, water is not only patient, it is deliberate. Every curve of a river's path is the result of countless decisions, some swift, some subtle, made by its own flowing body as it meets the contours of the world. It does not argue with the cliff, it turns. It does not curse the fallen tree, it passes beneath. It does not resent the drought, it waits in the cool earth until the rains return. To live as water is to become untroubled by the need to control the form of the path, for the path is never truly fixed. The strength is in the movement itself, in refusing to become still out of fear of change. And in this refusal, there is a deeper truth, that surrender is not always loss, and control is not always gain. By yielding, water gains access to every space. By insisting on its shape, it would lose most. In the human spirit, this becomes the practice of entering situations with openness rather than rigidity, allowing oneself to be shaped by the experience without being consumed by it. Yet water's humility hides its immense capacity for power. It may begin as a trickle, gentle enough to pass unnoticed, but with time it gathers, it swells, it becomes a current that can sweep away what once seemed immovable. This is why the sage values the low ground. There, in the place where nothing seeks to stand tall, all things eventually meet. The low ground is the meeting point of rivers, the resting place of rain, the foundation upon which the mountains drain themselves. In human life, the low ground is found in listening, in observation, in the quiet taking in of what others offer without immediate need to respond or display. This gathering is not passive, it is preparation. For when the moment comes to act, one acts from abundance rather than emptiness. The sea is the king of streams because it lies beneath them, Lao Tzu writes. To lie beneath is to choose the position of reception rather than dominance, to let others come of their own will. This is the power of the one who does not chase but attracts, who does not demand loyalty but inspires it. And still, there is a gentleness that remains unbroken even in water's greatest force. The waves that batter the shore also carry life to it. The flood that reshapes the land leaves behind fertile soil. In the human soul, the equivalent is a firmness of principle that does not lose kindness, an ability to stand without cruelty. To be like water is to refuse the belief that one must harm to remain strong. There is also the teaching of reflection. Clear water mirrors the world without holding it, and in this, it teaches detachment. The sky's passing clouds, the moon's changing face, the faces of those who stand at the bank, all are held for a moment, then released. So should the mind hold its experiences, seen, known, and then allowed to pass without binding them to the self. This is not forgetfulness, but freedom from possession. And perhaps the most subtle teaching of water is its acceptance of cycles. It evaporates into the unseen sky, becomes cloud, returns as rain, gathers again into streams, never fearing that leaving its current form is the end. In human life, Every loss is a change of form, every ending a return to another beginning. The sage does not cling to what must transform, for the same river is never the same river, yet it is always the river. The night grows deeper still, and the flow of thought becomes indistinguishable from the flow of water itself, quiet, steady, certain that it will continue long after the listener's eyes close and the dream begins. In the stillness of thought, water becomes not only an element, but a principle that reaches into the core of human conduct. Lao Tzu saw in its quiet endurance a truth that words often fail to hold. The world is not conquered by those who push hardest, but by those who cannot be pushed aside. The stone resists once, twice, perhaps 100 times, but resistance is finite. Endurance has no such limit. Water does not exhaust itself in the act of overcoming. It overcomes by continuing. And in that continuation lies a subtle form of wisdom, one that does not see victory as a single, shining moment, but as a quiet inevitability that unfolds without the noise of battle. This is why the sage learns to value time as a companion rather than an enemy. Time, like water, wears down all that is fixed and unbending, but it also nourishes all that is willing to grow. To be in harmony with time is to refuse the false urgency of forcing outcomes before they are ready, to understand that the ripest fruit will fall without effort, that the seed beneath the soil already knows its way upward. Yet water's teaching is not passivity. It moves, always moves, shaping the land, feeding the roots, carrying life from one place to another. Even when it appears still, there is movement beneath, currents invisible to the eye, but strong enough to shift the bed of the river. So it is with the inner life. The most profound transformations often occur in the depths, where no one is looking. To cultivate such depth is to live without needing the constant approval of the surface world, to find strength in the unseen work that will, in time, emerge naturally. In this, water teaches the discipline of self-containment. It does not boast of where it has been or where it will go. It simply flows toward its purpose. And purpose for water is not a fixed point but a state of being. The river does not dream of the sea, it moves toward it because that is what it is. In human terms, this is to act in accordance with one's nature, not in pursuit of an image or reward. When action is aligned with nature, there is no exhaustion from pretending, no weariness from holding a shape that is not one's own. Water's humility is another part of its strength. It does not seek the highest place but finds the lowest, not out of shame, but because the lowest place is the gathering place. There streams unite. There life thrives. Lao Tzu saw that a ruler who holds himself low becomes the meeting point for his people, and a person who lowers pride becomes a friend to all. Humility is not weakness but access. It is the opening through which all things may pass. In the way of water, pride is a dam, and humility the open channel. And water's patience is not without its moments of sudden transformation. There are times when a river swells into a flood, when the quiet accumulation becomes an unstoppable surge. In life, this is the moment when long preparation meets the right conditions, when years of quiet work produce a single, undeniable movement. The flood is not reckless, it is the release of what was already stored. And when the force is spent, water returns to stillness, without regret for its brief display of power. This is a strength rare in the world, knowing when to act with full force and when to return to the quiet flow. Water also teaches transparency. It holds no secrets for itself, yet it conceals depths to those who look without truly seeing. In its clarity, it reflects the world faithfully. In its depth, it holds mysteries. This is the balance the sage seeks: openness without vulnerability to harm, depth without the need for display. And perhaps the most comforting of water's lessons is its inevitability. It will reach the sea, whether in days or decades, whether as a river, a stream, or a cloud returning as rain. There is no doubt in its journey, only the calm certainty of arrival. For a human life, this is the trust that one's path, if walked with constancy, will arrive where it must, without the strain of forcing each step. The night listens to these truths as a sleeper listens to the rain, not needing to grasp each drop, only to feel the rhythm that has no beginning and no end. And in that rhythm, the soul finds its own reflection, soft, patient, enduring. There is an ancient scene, imagined yet true, in which Lao Tzu sits by the edge of a slow-moving stream, his robes gathered loosely, the air scented with pine, and the quiet sweetness of distant blossoms. He does not speak at first, for the water is already teaching, and he listens as one listens to an elder. The stream glides past, carrying leaves that turn in gentle spirals, their movements directed not by will, but by the unhurried certainty of the current. Here he observes what many fail to see. Water does not compete, yet nothing can rival its persistence. It does not shout, yet its voice is heard by mountains and valleys alike. It does not resist, yet its path cannot be stopped. This is not only poetry, it is instruction for the human spirit. Life often presses the mind to harden, to defend, to meet force with greater force. But Lao Tzu's water reveals that the greater mastery is in avoiding the trap of direct collision. When the path is blocked, water bends. When confined, it finds the smallest opening. When pressed downward, it gains momentum. When lifted to the sky, it waits until it can fall again. In this lies the art of transforming what is given into what is needed. The sage learns to make use of the obstacles, to see in each constraint the chance to move differently, to let the shape of the challenge guide the shape of the response. And yet, water's way is not an excuse for inaction. Its patience is active. It is a patience that never ceases to work. Even the smallest drip, allowed enough time, can pierce stone. Even the gentlest wave, given enough repetition, can alter the shape of the shore. This is a reminder that progress is not always visible in the moment, that the most enduring changes are often invisible until they are complete. The heart that adopts water's pace learns not to demand immediate results, for it understands that the present moment is only a fragment of the whole journey. The mind too can be like a river, clear when it allows thought to flow freely, muddy when it clings to what it should release. When the mind is clear, it reflects truth without distortion, like still water beneath a moonlit sky. When agitated, it loses its depth, and even the brightest light cannot be seen within it. Thus, to live like water is to cultivate a calm within, not as a withdrawal from life, but as a condition for engaging with it fully. This calm is not broken by passing storms, for storms too are part of the great cycle. They churn the surface but cannot reach the deep currents below. Lao Tzu's teachings suggest that the soul should live in those deeper currents, steady and untroubled, letting the surface do as it must. There is also a quiet nobility in the way water nourishes without seeking recognition. It gives itself to roots and seeds without claiming ownership of the growth. It refreshes the weary without asking for thanks. In this, water becomes a model for generosity, offering without expectation, aiding without claiming credit. True virtue, in Lao Tzu's vision, is like this: unseen, unrecorded, yet essential to all life. And still, the paradox remains that water's gentleness is the very source of its strength. The sword is proud of its sharpness, but it dulls. The rock boasts of its weight, but it crumbles. The fire burns brightly, but it consumes itself. Water endures because it does not insist on being what it is not. It does not oppose the truth of its own nature. In this, there is a profound invitation to self-acceptance, to live in a way that does not fight one's essence, to be shaped without losing the core of who one is. And perhaps most profound of all is water's lesson of return. No matter how far it travels, it is always on its way back to the sea, its vast home where all rivers meet. In the same way, the human spirit, through countless changes of form and place, moves toward its own vastness, its own unbroken source. There is comfort in knowing that no detour is wasted, no delay permanent. All that moves with sincerity arrives. And so the night holds this thought as the stream outside continues its endless journey, whispering to the stones, to the trees, to the one who listens in stillness, that the way forward is not in force, but in flow, not in holding on, but in letting go, not in speed, but in the certainty of return. In the quiet reach of night, the image of water deepens into a mirror for the human soul, showing that softness is not the absence of power, but its most enduring form. Lao Tzu understood this in a way that was more than metaphor. He saw it in the valleys where rivers had carved their way through ancient stone, in the delicate persistence of rain that, drop by drop, reshaped the face of the earth. The lesson was clear. What yields can also prevail. What bends can outlast what refuses to move. This truth unsettles the mind, trained to think in terms of dominance, of winning by strength alone, for it suggests that victory can be silent, almost invisible, and still absolute. The sage sees in this not a contradiction, but a deeper harmony, a reminder that power and gentleness are not enemies. To live like water is to resist the temptation to meet every challenge with direct opposition. It is to understand that the straightest line is not always the best path, that sometimes the way forward is found by flowing around the obstacle rather than breaking it apart. Water knows no impatience. It does not rush to overcome, nor does it despair when blocked. Instead, it trusts the quiet mathematics of time, the slow inevitability of its nature. And time for water is not an adversary, but a companion. In human life, this translates to an acceptance that not all things can or should be forced into the present moment, that some transformations can only be completed through the unhurried accumulation of days and seasons. Yet water is never still in its essence. Even in the calmest pool, there are movements too subtle for the eye to catch. Tiny currents shifting, life sustained below the surface. This hidden activity is a reminder that patience is not idleness, that stillness can contain its own quiet work. For the one who listens, this suggests a way of living in which effort is steady and continuous, but never frantic, where change is pursued without the strain of desperation. Water also teaches humility by seeking the lowest places, not out of shame, but because these are the gathering places, the points where streams unite. Lao Tzu knew that a person who can dwell in humility becomes a point of connection, a meeting ground for others, a source of nourishment and support. Pride stands apart and alone. Humility gathers and multiplies. In this way, lowering oneself becomes a form of strength, a way of holding more rather than less. And water's humility is not weakness, for it can rise as vapor, move with the wind, fall again as rain. It is always willing to change its form, to adapt without losing its essence. In human terms, this is the courage to let go of rigid identities, to allow oneself to be shaped by circumstances without being broken by them. Such adaptability is not a betrayal of self, but a return to the core of one's nature. For just as water is water, whether in river, cloud or snow, a person remains themselves through all transformations if they remain true to their essence. Water also holds the lesson of clarity. A clear stream reflects the sky perfectly, but when stirred by violence, it becomes opaque, its depths hidden. So too the mind, which can only reflect truth when it is calm. Anger, fear, and agitation cloud it, making even the simplest truths difficult to see. To live like water is to cultivate a mind that clears quickly, that allows disturbances to pass through without clinging to them. Such clarity is not constant perfection, it is the ability to return to transparency again and again. And in the moments when water swells into flood, when its force is suddenly visible and irresistible, it shows that gentleness does not mean weakness, that patience does not mean passivity. When the conditions are right, when the moment has ripened, water moves with unstoppable force, sweeping away what was thought immovable. The wise person too knows when to act decisively after long preparation, when to let stored potential become a single, transformative act. Yet when the surge is over, water returns to its quiet flow, without clinging to its moment of power, without seeking to preserve it. This is the rhythm of life well lived, times of stillness, times of movement, each with their place, each flowing naturally into the other. And so in the dim candlelight, the lesson of water becomes more than words. It becomes a presence, a way of breathing and being. It asks nothing, demands nothing, only invites the listener to soften, to endure, to flow, to trust that the path will lead where it must, not through force, but through the inevitability of what cannot be stopped. In this, the heart begins to understand what the mountains have always known, that even the hardest stone must one day bow to the gentlest touch, repeated without end. The moon hangs low over the still surface of a hidden lake, silver lights scattered across the ripples where a breeze has touched the water and moved on. In this quiet, Lao Tzu's thought takes shape, not as a rigid doctrine, but as something living, flowing, breathing. Water is his teacher, his metaphor, his mirror. In its patience, he sees the futility of haste. In its humility, he sees the power of yielding. And in its unbroken persistence, he sees the inevitability of transformation. The mountains believe themselves eternal, yet the streams carve their faces with patient hands. The walls built by human ambition crumble where rain seeps into their smallest cracks. Time favours the gentle, not because it is sentimental, but because gentleness works in harmony with its long cycles, never exhausting itself in the illusion of control. A person who understands this no longer measures progress in sudden victories, but in the subtle shifts that unfold quietly and without announcement. Water teaches that one need not always push forward. Sometimes it is wiser to wait, to let the terrain reveal its openings, to let gravity do the work. And yet this waiting is not the waiting of passivity. It is the waiting of a seed before spring, alive with hidden growth. Even the softest drop wears away the stone, not by force but by returning, again and again, unchanged in its intent. Lao Tzu saw that a life lived in such a way becomes unshakable. No insult can wound it deeply, for it flows past. No obstacle can hold it forever, for it finds another way. No loss can destroy it, for it knows the sea awaits at the end of every journey. This way of being is neither resistance nor surrender, but a deeper synthesis where one chooses the form of surrender that becomes its own kind of resistance. In the stillness of water, there is also a lesson about reflection. When undisturbed, it reveals what stands above it with perfect clarity. The human mind too is capable of such clarity, but only when it is allowed to settle, when the storms of emotion have been given time to pass. Clarity cannot be forced. It arrives naturally when the agitation is released. To see truly, one must learn to let the sediment of thought sink to the depths until the surface shines like a mirror. And yet water is not afraid to be stirred, for it knows the sediment will settle again. There is no fear of change in its nature, no desperate clinging to form. A river is not less itself when it becomes mist, nor when the mist becomes rain. The essence remains even as the shape shifts. This is the freedom that comes from self-knowledge, the understanding that identity is not bound to one moment, one role, one appearance. When the mind adopts this fluidity, life's transitions no longer appear as threats but as natural phases of the same unbroken current. In its giving, water teaches a final quiet truth. It nourishes without discrimination, flowing equally to the just and the unjust, the beautiful and the decayed. It asks for nothing in return. This is the highest form of generosity, one that gives not because of obligation or desire for recognition, but because giving is simply its way of being. A life shaped in this image finds its own fulfillment in the act itself, not in the reward. The candle on the low table flickers as a breath of night air slips into the room, and the listener can almost hear the voice of that ancient sage, not as a command, but as a suggestion. Be like water. Let strength be hidden within gentleness. Let movement be guided by the path that opens before you. Let your persistence be so natural that even you forget you're enduring. When the world becomes hard and unyielding, do not try to match it blow for blow. Flow into the spaces it leaves unguarded. And when joy or sorrow rise suddenly like a flood, let them pass without grasping. Return to your calm channel, to the deep and steady current that cannot be seen from the surface. In this way, the heart learns not only to survive but to prevail, not by winning but by outlasting, not by dominating but by transforming. For in the end, all things return to the sea, and the sea waits for nothing yet receives everything.